They buried her on a Friday afternoon, and by sunset she climbed out of the grave. Essie Dunbar was declared dead after a sudden epileptic seizure. Just as the first shovelfuls of dirt hit the lid, her sister arrived late, demanding to see her face one last time. When they opened the coffin, Essie sat up and smiled. The town ran screaming, believing they had seen a ghost. But Essie wasn't a ghost, and she was alive. For the next 47 years, she would live with the memory of being buried alive, and the fear that death might one day make the same mistake twice. If this story unsettled you, like this video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the Shadow Book for more true stories buried in the dark corners of history. It began in the middle of a late summer afternoon, the kind of heat that silences everything. The sky over South Carolina hung low, thick and unmoving. Essie Dunbar had been working near the porch when she stopped speaking mid-sentence, eyes rolling upward. Her body stiffened, then folded. The sound she made was not a scream, but a sharp breath pulled through her teeth, the only warning before she hit the floorboards. Within minutes, neighbors were running from every direction. Someone shouted for the doctor. Someone else fetched a fan. By the time Dr. D.K. Briggs arrived, sweat had already soaked through her dress. Briggs carried a black leather bag that looked older than he was. Inside were the essentials: a mirror, a stethoscope, a vial of ether, and a single notebook of death certificates. He pressed 2 fingers to her throat, then her wrist. He waited, listening. The air inside the room was so still that every fly's movement sounded like breathing. He checked again, this time with the mirror, no fog. He leaned close, held his ear near her mouth and waited. Nothing. He drew back slowly and straightened his tie. The neighbors watched for a verdict. The doctor said quietly, "She's gone." No one questioned him. No one suggested waiting. They had seen death before, quick, decisive, and ordinary. One woman crossed herself. Another started humming a hymn. A man went outside to tell the others. By the time the sun began to drop behind the trees, the whole town had already heard. Briggs stayed long enough to write the certificate. He filled it out at the table beside the window, his handwriting neat, deliberate. The candle beside her bed flickered once as the ink dried. He glanced at it, frowning, then looked back down. "Cause of death," he wrote, "sudden seizure." He tore the page from the pad, signed his name, and slipped it into his bag. Outside, a crowd had gathered. Some offered to help with the arrangements. Others just wanted to see the doctor's face, to be sure. Briggs told them it was over, that she had felt nothing. He spoke with the practiced calm of a man certain of his trade. Behind him, the door to the house remained open, letting the hot wind move through the room. The wind lifted the lace curtain, then dropped it again across her hand. If he had stayed another minute, he might have noticed the faint tremor in her fingers, the tiny pulse under the skin. Not the movement of life returning, but the last echo of a seizure fading through the body. But the doctor was already walking back toward his horse, his coat over one arm, the certificate folded neatly in his pocket. Inside the house, the candle beside her body flickered again, steady this time, throwing her shadow up the wall, a brief suggestion of motion mistaken for light. Outside, someone said the words that would begin the story. "Essie Dunbar is dead." They washed her body like scripture, slow, careful, and wordless. The air inside the small house was thick with heat and the smell of lye soap. No one spoke her name after dark. It was bad luck to call back the dead. 3 women from the neighborhood worked by lamplight, each taking a task, one washing, one dressing, one sewing the burial gown. Their voices stayed low, humming bits of old hymns that trembled more than they sang. Essie's skin was warm still, not the cold they expected. One woman mentioned it quietly, and the others told her not to say such things. They said the Lord sometimes took time to finish his work. They tied her hair with a white ribbon, folded her hands at the chest, and laid a sprig of rosemary between them. It was supposed to keep away spirits, though none of them said aloud which kind. Outside, men hammered together a coffin borrowed from the church storeroom, pine boards, rough-edged, too large for her small frame. Every sound from the hammer echoed through the walls like thunder. Inside, one of the women kept wiping sweat from Essie's forehead, muttering that it was strange how it wouldn't stay dry. The others told her to stop noticing things. When the dress was finished, they slipped it over her shoulders and buttoned it up the back. Her mouth had fallen slightly open. A woman used her thumb to close it, holding the jaw in place with a handkerchief tied around her head. "There," she whispered, "proper again." They sprinkled a little talcum on her hands so she wouldn't look damp. For a moment she looked more asleep than gone, and that was what unsettled them most. One helper swore she saw a faint mist form on Essie's lips, like the breath of someone dreaming. She blinked, leaned closer, then stepped back quickly. "It's nothing," she said louder than she meant to. The others didn't ask what she'd seen. They were all seeing things now, a finger that looked like it twitched, a shiver that could have been the breeze. The mind played tricks when fear sat too close. When they lifted her into the coffin, the boards creaked as if objecting. The men outside returned to help lower the lid. They drove 4 nails, one at each corner, each strike duller than the last. A hymn started quietly in the background, a broken line of "Nearer, my God, to Thee." The women stood back, their faces slick with sweat and candlelight. No one noticed the fly that landed on Essie's lip and stayed there, unmoving. As the lid came down, her sister was still miles away on the night train, unaware that by the time she arrived, the earth itself would be waiting. The last sound inside the room was the final nail sinking home, a sound meant to keep what was inside from ever getting out. They sang for 2 hours, not because they mourned, but because they feared silence. The small church was packed tight, air heavy with perfume and sweat, the windows open wide but useless against the heat. Every fan creaked in wrath. He came back at sunrise, not to question himself, but to confirm he was right. The house smelled of soap and pinewood from the coffin waiting near the door. Inside, the women who'd worked through the night sat silently, their hands folded in their laps, their faces drawn and pale from exhaustion. Dr. D.K. Briggs nodded to them, removed his hat and said he'd just like a final look. No one objected. No one dared to. He opened his black bag again, the same one he'd carried for 20 years. The instruments clinked faintly inside. The mirror, the stethoscope, the same paper form with his signature still drying in ink. He glanced toward the body on the table, neatly dressed now, hair combed, the skin faintly powdered to hide its warmth. Briggs adjusted his spectacles, muttering that he didn't expect to find anything new. The women watched as he bent over Essie's face. He held the small mirror just above her mouth and waited. No fog, no condensation. He counted to 10 under his breath and nodded. "You see," he said softly, as though teaching a lesson, "when the breath has gone, so has the spirit." One of the women crossed herself. Another turned away. They wanted to believe him, that the work of death was tidy, that mistakes were impossible. Briggs rested 2 fingers on her wrist and frowned. The flesh still had a faint elasticity, but he told himself it was because she died recently. He noted the stiffness in her joints. "Rigor setting in," he said aloud, more for the record than for the truth. He didn't know that epilepsy could leave the body rigid for hours, muscles locked in a false imitation of death. To him, the tension was proof of certainty. Outside, a rooster crowed. He straightened, brushed his hands against his coat, and told them they could proceed with the burial. The family, he said, should take comfort that she'd passed peacefully. The word peacefully hung in the room like an instruction. No one challenged it. He looked once more at her face, the way the jaw had set, the faint color that hadn't yet left her lips. For a brief second, something unsettled him. He couldn't explain why her skin hadn't cooled completely. He reached for her hand. It felt neither warm nor cold, but somewhere in between. "The body holds heat longer in summer," he said quickly, though no one had asked. Then he packed his tools and snapped the case shut. On his way out, he told the women to keep the coffin closed until the service, to avoid any unnecessary disturbance. He smiled politely, the kind of smile meant to end a conversation. The women nodded, grateful for the certainty his presence offered. As the doctor stepped back into the morning light, the room fell quiet again. A single droplet of sweat rolled down his temple as he adjusted his hat. Inside, beneath the thin veil of powder, a small muscle twitched just below Essie Dunbar's jaw, a final pulse of life that no one saw, and that he had not stayed long enough to notice. With the hymn. The coffin stood at the front, pale wood glowing faintly under the sun that pushed through the glass. The 3 ministers rotated through their sermons, each one longer than the last, each promising peace, rest, and divine assurance that death was final. Essie's body lay at the center of it all, her hands folded over the rosemary, her lips slightly parted as though holding a breath she'd forgotten to exhale. People whispered about how peaceful she looked. The older women said it was proof of a clean soul. The younger ones avoided looking too long, unsettled by how natural she seemed. The body had been declared dead less than 24 hours, but that detail no one mentioned aloud. In towns like this, faith filled the gaps that medicine left behind. Dr. Briggs sat near the back, coat folded neatly across his knees, eyes fixed on the pulpit. He listened to the ministers repeat his conclusion in their own language. The Lord called her home. Each word absolved him further. To question her death now would mean doubting not only the doctor, but God himself, and no one would dare do that. When the singing paused, the line began. Mourners filed past the coffin one by one, hands brushing the edge, whispers of rest easy and gone too soon. The candles around her burned low, their smoke curling upward and vanishing into the rafters. Somewhere near the middle of the line, a child tugged at his mother's dress and whispered, "Mama," her chest moved. The mother's hand clamped over his mouth before he could say it again. "Hush," she hissed. "Show respect." The boy looked back once more, but no one else saw what he'd seen. Or if they did, they pretended otherwise. Outside, the heat thickened. The church bell rang again, the signal that the service had gone long. People began glancing toward the door, anxious for air, for water, for closure. But the burial couldn't begin yet. Essie's sister was still on the morning train, hours behind schedule. The ministers agreed to wait. The coffin stayed at the front of the church, the lid nailed shut but resting too lightly on its hinges. Each creak of the wood sounded like breath shifting underneath. By early afternoon, the congregation had thinned to a handful of patient relatives and restless deacons. Dr. Briggs left quietly, shaking hands on his way out, confident that his name would never be questioned. The others stayed humming softly in the heat, their eyes half closed, their faith doing the work their nerves could not. When the sister finally arrived, breathless, covered in dust, dress clinging to her skin, the clock on the wall showed exactly 2 hours delay. The funeral resumed as if nothing strange had happened. But among those who had waited, there was a shared unease, the sense that something had been holding its breath inside that church, waiting for her to arrive. By noon, the ground was waiting. The sun had climbed high above the small cemetery behind the church, bleaching the red clay to a dull glare. Men loosened their collars and wiped their necks with handkerchiefs, their shirts sticking to their backs as they took positions around the coffin. The congregation followed slowly, voices softened by heat and habit. Someone started a hymn but lost the tune halfway through. No one minded. It was the motion that mattered, the act of carrying, lowering, covering. The path to the grave was short but uneven. The pallbearers moved carefully, the pine box swaying slightly with every step. One man muttered that it felt heavier than it should have. Another told him not to talk. When they reached the edge of the open grave, the ropes were already waiting. The red clay crumbled at the edges, dry as ash. Someone said it would rain before evening. Someone else said it always did after a funeral. They positioned the coffin above the hole, set the ropes, and began the slow descent. The sound of rope against wood, the dry rhythmic creak, filled the air. A child whimpered, hushed immediately by his mother's hand. The box touched bottom with a dull thud. A cloud moved across the sun then, throwing a brief shadow over everyone's faces. For a few seconds the world dimmed. The preacher recited his final verse, his voice tired from the long service. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The shovel passed from hand to hand. Each man took his turn, scooping earth and letting it fall. The dirt struck the lid with a sound that felt too alive, too sharp. They tried not to notice. The rhythm steadied, mechanical, hypnotic. With every shovelful, the sound softened, more distant. Halfway through, the gravedigger paused. He thought he heard something, a faint, dry tap from below. He held still, listening. A breeze moved through the trees, rattling the leaves. "You hear that?" he asked the man beside him. "Just wood settling," came the reply. The gravedigger nodded, though he wasn't sure. He threw in another scoop. The sound came again, maybe echo, maybe not. He worked faster. The women at the edge of the graveyard fanned themselves, watching silently. The minister closed his book. The dirt kept falling, heavier now, until the box was no longer visible. Only the outline of fresh soil remained, red against the green grass. A worker tamped it down with the flat of his shovel, careful, respectful. No one spoke. It was done. But as the last shovelful fell, the sound changed. Not the dull thud they expected, but a softer, hollow note, almost like breath pushing through wood. The gravedigger hesitated again, his shovel half buried in the earth. He waited for someone else to move first. No one did. The hymn picked up again, voices rising weakly over the field. He pressed the dirt flat, told himself it was nothing, and walked away. Behind him, the new grave held its silence, complete, contained, and irreversible. She came running through dust and heat, shouting for a face already covered. The horse cart rattled up the hill so fast that the driver had to pull hard on the reins to stop at the edge of the cemetery. The funeral crowd turned all at once, a wave of black dresses and white shirts catching the sun. Essie's sister leapt down before the cart had even stopped, her hat falling behind her. "Wait!" she shouted. "Don't put her in!" By then the coffin was half buried. The red clay had already begun to swallow it, just enough to hide the edges. The gravediggers froze mid-motion, their shovels suspended. The ministers exchanged looks, uncertain. One murmured that the service was over, that she'd arrived too late. But she kept walking forward, stumbling through the rows, her dress snagging on weeds. "I came all this way," she said. "I have to see her face," the crowd murmured, soft, unsure. Some said it wasn't right to disturb the dead. Others whispered that it would bring bad luck. The sister didn't hear them, or refused to. She fell to her knees beside the grave and grabbed a handful of loose dirt, scooping it away, as if the act alone could change the truth. One of the preachers knelt beside her, trying to pull her back. "Let her rest, child," he said, his voice trembling. "She's at peace now." But the sister only stared at him, her voice shaking but firm. "You don't know her like I do," she said. "She doesn't rest easy." There was something in her tone that silenced the field. No one spoke again. The gravedigger looked to the ministers for permission. They hesitated, weighing scripture against compassion, and finally one nodded. "Let her see," he said quietly. The men moved reluctantly, digging back the dirt they'd just laid. Each shovelful came up damp, heavy. The box appeared again, its lid speckled with red clay and fingerprints. The sound of the nails being pried loose cut through the heat like snapping bone. People turned away, pretending not to watch. One woman whispered that they shouldn't be doing this. Another said it was too late anyway. Still, the sister stayed close, her hands trembling against the edge of the coffin. The preacher wiped his forehead. "It'll only take a minute," he muttered, though no one was sure who he was speaking to. The screwdriver slipped once, splintering a corner of the lid. A faint sound followed, the echo of wood shifting against pressure. The men froze. The sister leaned closer, eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she asked. No one answered. Someone coughed. Someone else began to pray under their breath. What if she'd been 1 minute later? A woman whispered behind her fan. The final screw gave way with a soft groan. The lid loosened, edges creaking. No one moved to open it. The preacher's hand hovered, his face drained of color. From somewhere in the back of the crowd, a man's voice broke the silence, low, almost pleading. "Don't look." The first thing she saw wasn't light. It was her sister's shadow bending over the coffin. The air inside was thick and dry, pressing down on her chest like stone. When her eyes opened, the world above her came in fragments. Faces leaning forward, sunlight breaking across the rim of the box, the sound of someone gasping. She tried to move and her fingers twitched. The wood scraped against her nails. For a moment no one breathed. Then she sat up, slow, uneven, her spine lifting as if pulled by invisible strings. Her head turned toward her sister, eyes glassy and unfocused. The muscles in her jaw tightened, pulling her lips into something that looked like a smile. Her sister cried out, stumbling backward, hands shaking as she reached toward her and then away. No one moved to help. The ministers stared, mouths open, their verses unfinished. One dropped his Bible. It hit the dirt with a soft thud. The others took a step back. Someone whispered, "Lord have mercy." Another screamed. The air filled with chaos. The sudden scraping of shoes, the rustle of dresses, the pounding of feet. Her body wasn't cold. Her pupils constricted in the sunlight. She blinked hard, disoriented, pulling air into her lungs in broken gasps that sounded almost like laughter. The sound sent people running. They scattered in every direction, convinced they were seeing something unholy. The ministers tried to lead them, but tripped over each other in the rush. The shortest one fell, knocked down by the other's panic, his ribs cracking under a heel. He cried out, unheard beneath the screams. Essie's sister stayed where she was, frozen. "Essie?" she whispered. The name came out like a question she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Essie's head tilted slightly, eyes struggling to focus, her breath shallow and uneven. Her lips moved, but no words came. Just the faint curl of that same unsettling smile. Not joy, not recognition, but the last remnant of a nervous system forcing itself back to life. The crowd had fled by then. The preacher's hat lay in the dirt beside a half-open Bible. The grave gaped behind her, half-filled, its edges crumbling in the heat. The flies that had followed her from the house hovered now in lazy circles above the coffin. Essie's sister stepped closer, one trembling hand on the edge, tears streaking her face. "It's all right," she said, though her voice betrayed her. "You're safe." Essie tried to stand. Her knees buckled, her hands slipped on the wood, and for a moment she looked like a newborn thing, uncertain of the world it had entered. She steadied herself, took one shaking breath, and lifted her face toward the light. Somewhere beyond the field a scream echoed again, high, distant, and terrified. Essie's eyes followed the sound, confused. Then she looked down at her hands, the dirt still clinging to her fingertips. She smiled once more, the same involuntary, impossible smile, and the last of the mourners disappeared over the hill. They ran from her like she'd crawled out of hell, though she was the only living one there. The first scream broke the still air and sent the whole crowd surging toward the gate. People tripped over headstones, over one another, over the preacher who'd fallen gasping in the dust. His hat rolled away, crushed under someone's heel. The hymn books scattered across the ground, pages fluttering like startled birds. The quiet order of the funeral turned in seconds into the chaos of flight. Essie blinked against the sunlight, her body stiff, her balance uncertain. Her hands shook as she tried to climb out of the coffin, her nails scraping the edge of the box. She looked around for her sister, for anyone who might help her understand where she was, what had happened. But all she saw were backs, people running, dresses tearing, hats flying. Her voice came out cracked, a dry whisper. "Wait!" The preacher with the broken ribs groaned where he'd fallen, one hand pressed to his side. He looked up once and saw her moving toward him, her eyes wide and dazed, her mouth open as if to speak. His face twisted with terror. "Lord, save me," he rasped, dragging himself backward through the dust. She stopped, confused. He wasn't calling to her. He was calling to be spared from her. A gust of wind swept through the cemetery, catching the scent of turned soil and sweat. The sound of footsteps faded toward the road, replaced by the faint clatter of a wagon being overturned in haste. Someone shouted that it was a sign, that the dead had risen. Others screamed her name as if it were a curse. The last of the ministers clambered through the gate, one shoe missing, his collar hanging loose. Behind him the field emptied. Essie stepped forward, unsteady on her feet. The coffin behind her rocked slightly, still half in the grave. She reached out a hand toward the preacher on the ground, but he flinched, rolling away and crawling into the weeds. "Please," she tried again, voice trembling. "Don't leave me." He didn't look back. No one did. She turned in a slow circle, taking in the quiet that followed the stampede. The graveyard was a ruin. Hymn books in the grass, a Bible face down in the dirt, a torn ribbon from her sister's hat caught on a branch. The air still buzzed with the echoes of voices that were already gone. For the first time she noticed the smell, the sweet, suffocating mix of clay, sweat, and the faint trace of her own body pressed against pine. She calls their names. No one answers. The words would have sounded like a story later, something retold and exaggerated, but in that moment they were only truth. The town had fled, and she was standing barefoot in her own graveyard, alive, breathing, unrecognized. She looked toward the hilltop, where the road curved back into town, and saw the last figures disappearing into the distance. The wind settled. The hymn they'd been singing still hung faintly in the air, the echo of it rising from the trees. Essie climbed fully out of the coffin and stood beside the open hole. Her sister's ribbon brushed against her foot. She bent down, picked it up, and turned toward the empty road. The world silent except for the faint hum of a hymn that no one was singing anymore. They called her blessed, but they stopped sitting beside her in church. For days after the burial that wasn't, the town spoke of nothing else. What had begun as whispers turned into stories, and the stories turned into warnings. Some said it was a miracle. Others said it wasn't natural. The doctor, when asked, refused to answer at all. He told anyone who pressed him that the body can play tricks after death, that nerves twitch, lungs gasp, hearts stutter. But even he stopped using her name. Essie stayed indoors. Her sister locked the doors at night and drew the curtains, though no one came by anymore. When she stepped outside for water, children followed her at a distance, daring each other to call her name. "The dead lady," they whispered. She could hear them. She didn't correct them. Dr. Briggs rode past her house every morning on his way to patients farther up the road. He always looked straight ahead, hands tight on the reins. Once her sister waved to him, but he didn't lift his hand. He was the only man in the county who could have explained what happened, and the only one who wanted to forget it. Inside the house, Essie tried to live quietly. She cooked. She mended clothes. She moved slowly, as if the wrong motion might draw attention from something watching. Nights were worse. Sleep came shallow, full of half-formed dreams. When she closed her eyes, she saw wood inches above her face and smelled earth. She woke gasping, nails digging into her palms. "You're safe," her sister told her. But even her sister's voice trembled when she said it. Not long after, the sister began to dream too, of the grave, of a coffin that wouldn't stay shut. In her dreams, she wasn't standing at the edge this time. She was inside it. She told no one. She started avoiding mirrors, claiming they showed the wrong reflection. Some nights, Essie found her standing by the window before dawn, whispering that she could still hear shovels in the distance. The townspeople went back to their routines, though something in them had shifted. When Essie came to church again, the preacher stumbled over his sermon. People made room in the pew but didn't meet her eyes. They avoided saying the word alive in her presence, as if it didn't quite apply. She stopped lying down to sleep after that. She would sit upright in a chair by the window, hands folded in her lap, the mirror from her dresser propped against the wall across from her. "So I can see myself breathing," she said once when her sister asked. Her tone was steady, almost calm. Just to be sure, the nights grew longer that way, quiet, watchful, endless. Sometimes she'd think she heard a sound outside. Soft scraping, shifting earth, or maybe wind through the clay. She never opened the door to check. Each night before dawn, she listened for it, that faint, impossible sound of dirt being moved, slow and patient, somewhere close. When she finally died in 1962, they checked 3 times to be sure. The house was quiet, the curtains drawn, and the air smelled faintly of camphor and old fabric. By then, most of the people who'd watched her climb out of the ground were gone themselves. Only her sister's daughter remained, grey-haired and watchful, sitting at the edge of the bed as the nurse took her pulse. "She's gone," the nurse said softly. And then, almost immediately, she checked again. Essie Dunbar was 77. For 47 years, she had lived in the narrow space between fear and habit. Her life had become a ritual of caution, the mirror propped beside her bed to catch the faintest breath, the candle burning even in daylight, the window always left half open. She refused to be buried too soon. She'd said it so often that it became part of her introductions. "If I die," she would say, "wait 3 days before you bury me." It was half warning, half prayer. The town remembered her story the way they remembered a storm, something that had once frightened them but eventually folded into memory. Children grew up hearing that a woman had once risen from her coffin and walked home again. Some believed it, some didn't. The older folks stopped arguing about it. Time dulled the edges, but it never erased the unease. When people passed her house, they still glanced at the window, half expecting movement. In her final years, Essie grew thin and slow, but never careless. She slept sitting up, her chin resting on her chest as if refusing to give her body the stillness that once betrayed her. She spoke little. The few neighbors who visited said she asked the same question every time. "Do I look alive to you?" They would smile and reassure her, and she would nod satisfied, though she never looked convinced. When her health failed, she refused to go to the hospital. "Too many doctors," she said, "and not enough time to wake up if they're wrong." So she stayed home, her niece watching over her. The mirror still by the bed, the candle still burning. The night she died, the candle guttered and went out on its own. The nurse, when she came, did everything by the book. pulse, breath, pupils, reflex. Then she did it again, and again. Each time she wrote the same word, confirmed. At the funeral there was no crowd, no panic, no running. Only a handful of people, quiet and deliberate, following the coffin down the same red clay path where the first burial had failed. The sun was high, the ground dry. The ropes creaked as they lowered her, the sound almost tender. No one hurried. No one spoke until the last shovel of dirt fell. As the mourners turned to leave, a nurse who'd helped prepare the body hesitated. She looked down at her gloved hands, then back toward the grave. "Strange," she whispered. Her knuckles were marked. Small pale crescents, scars that hadn't healed right, as if made long ago by wood and desperation. No one answered. The grave diggers tamped the soil flat, and the last hymn faded into the air. When the silence settled, every mourner lingered a moment longer than necessary, just to be sure nothing moved. If this story unsettled you, like this video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to The Shadow Book for more true stories buried in the dark corners of history.